Metallica are the biggest heavy metal band in the world. Over the course of their 25-year career, they sold over 90 million albums, won Grammy Awards, and toured the world dozens of times. They've survived death, alcohol addiction, on-stage accidents, lineup changes, and endless accusations of selling out to become a genuine musical phenomenon. The Metallica of today is a far different beast to the one which first stepped on stage in Los Angeles back in March 1982.
They took a bunch of different bands and basically threw them in a blender and sped it up. So for me, it was like a lot of stuff they did was almost familiar.
Just the over-the-top craziness. I mean, they were playing the kind of music nobody really had done too much before. I mean, there's Motorhead and Venom and stuff like that.
But it was sped up with, attitude and everything else with it. No one else was doing that at the time.
Lars Ulrich somehow managed to get himself onto a metal compilation album, even though he couldn't play drums and didn't even have a band. So he advertised to get a band together, and they had to go Halcyon, and he put the band together, and that's how they basically formed the band.
I think they put an ad out that they were looking for a guitar player, and I think Dave responded to the ad. And and Dave saw that they were influenced by new wave of British heavy metal, so I believe that's how they got together.
Metallica only showed real promise after they were joined by two talented musicians, guitarist Dave Mustaine and bassist Cliff Burton.
They were really drunk, doing those shows, but you could hear the improvement when Cliff had joined, just with the amazing technique he had on the bass. They just only played a couple of gigs together with Cliff and Dave in the band at the same time.
It was pretty much off the hook. I remember watching this band, and it was it was pretty amazing, actually. It was pretty raw, but it was a trip because you had Dave Mustaine and James, and they both kind of were frontmen. One, for one song, James would announce that song or whatever, and then for another song, Dave would, talk.
This is a classic, I'm sure you've all heard.
And you kind of saw that kind of separation there, but it kind of worked. And James was off the hook. He reminded me of Reagan from The Exorcist. He was just wow, just real crazy. But it was something really cool, and I knew they were going to do something from that first show.
They'd seen Cliff play in a band called Trauma, who were based here in the Bay Area.
Cliff was a very nice guy. I'd met him when he was in a band called Trauma before that. And I knew a friend of mine knew the guitar player from Trauma, so we would go see them and stuff, and Cliff was amazing. He's just, you looked at him, like everybody else in the band, they were good at what they did, I guess, but they weren't, moving like he did, and it's just, he was the focal point of that whole band.
Everybody said, this band is pretty good, but you gotta see this bass player. And, everybody's just talking about this bass player. It's just unbelievable. So naturally, it was a must to see. All of a sudden, he was in Metallica.
Trauma came and played a show down in LA where the guys in Metallica were based at the time. And they were really blown away by how great Cliff was, and they got a hold of Cliff and like, dude, we want you to join our band, because they weren't happy with Ron. And Cliff said, well, I'd be in to join you guys, but I ain't gonna move to LA, so you're gonna have to come up here if you want me to join your band. So they kicked Ron out of the band and moved up here to San Francisco, where they'd already gigged a few times and were very successful and really built a following up here, and they loved it here anyway, so it was just a natural for them to move here, and that's how they got together with Cliff.
San Francisco shows were just off the hook. Crazy, drunken bashes. Well, it's kind of funny, the first time I took pictures of them, there was no camera policy, and I ended up getting my film taken away by the security. They tried to expose the film, and I ended up getting it back. Luckily, I rewound it back into the camera. And that ended up being the shot that Cliff used on the album, which is ironic, so it almost didn't exist. Back then you were allowed to take pictures of all the concerts. You didn't have to have a photo pass, you know. It wasn't big business like it is now, you know. First 3 songs and all that baloney. So I just thought it was really cool to document, you know, the shows. And it was really neat to get some really cool concert shots in there.
They gained popularity pretty fast. You know, I'd say within a year's time, a lot of people knew about them that never knew about them before, and their popularity got bigger and bigger after that.
Cliff, he would like headbang, and the rest of the band would be going like this fast, and he would be going like half speed. And I could just get some incredible shots of him with his hair sticking straight up in the air. Yeah, you couldn't get a bad photo of him. He was just an incredible bass player all the way around. But yeah, I think Cliff, he was just, I don't know, I've never seen anybody like him to this day. I mean, he used all the crazy wah-wah pedals, the effects and stuff. It was just incredible. And just the conviction they had on stage. James, at first he wasn't that much of a front man. He wasn't very sure of himself, but through the years he's really gotten really good at that. Now it's like he's a natural up there.
In early 1983, Metallica were invited to New York by store owner John Zazula, who funded the recording of their debut album and released it on his own Megaforce label after failing to interest any record labels in the band. But before this happened, Dave Mustaine was fired.
Yeah, well, Dave had been a problem for a long time with his alcoholism and such. Basically, when they were they had basically decided they wanted to get rid of him when they were traveling to New York to get ready to record the album, you know, they were like I think listening to tapes on the way down there while Dave was sleeping in the back, and they were very interested in Kirk Hammett, who played with a band called Exodus, who Metallica had played with a few times.
So when they got there, it was like, you know, Johnny Z's like, hey, you know, great, let's sign a record contract. And they're like, you know, we got a problem. So, you know, they called Kirk, and he was the only guy they called. And I remember when he got that call, he was like, you know, Exodus was doing really well. And he was like, and he was asking, you know, he asked me, you know, his friends and stuff, you know, what do you think I should do? And I said, well, man, they're signing a record deal, dude, and they're really good. So, you know, you might want to think about doing that.
So it was like when they first got there to New York, it's like they made the phone call to Kirk, and they wanted Kirk to fly out there, and then they had to tell Dave, hey, dude, you're out of the band. Like they did, like I think like the day after, the first day they were there, they all get around Dave and wake him up and tell him he's out of the band. And you know, which was of course very upsetting to Dave. They put him on a Greyhound bus all the way back to L.A. from New York to L.A. So he had a couple of days on the road to think about it, and you know they had to get him out of there because Kirk was flying in, and if Kirk got in there, it would have been a big fight. So they had to get Dave out of there as soon as they could.
Musically, it was really a nice fit, but I think personality-wise, something had to give. But what they brought to the table together for Metallica was really unique, because there's a lot of riffs that Dave had brought to Metallica that they used even later on after he left.
Dave did everything 110. He was on 10 all the time, you know. Whatever Dave wanted, Dave got, basically, you know. So when he left the band, they lost a little something, but they gained stability as far as I'm concerned. You know, Kirk's a good guitar player too, you know. So I think that's what they needed, you know. Dave running that show would have probably ended up dragging them straight down the toilet.
Dave was difficult. He was enough to deal with when he was sober. When that guy got drunk, forget about it.
After recruiting Exodus guitarist Kirk Hammett to replace Dave Mustaine, they recorded a blistering debut album, Kill 'Em All, so named in response to the record company executives who had failed to show any interest.
The album Kill 'Em All with Kirk's guitar playing sounds so much better than the demos, in my opinion. I mean, when I listen to the demos, I mean, I don't even know how they got signed because they just sound so awful compared to what was on the album, which was very polished and had all the speed and aggressiveness. I mean, my first turn onto them was when I heard Kill 'Em All. That album changed my life. I mean, I used to think the heaviest thing in metal was like Iron Maiden, pre-Sabbath, and when I heard Kill 'Em All, everything that I thought was heavy was considered obsolete. I mean, this made Iron Maiden sound like the Bee Gees.
They hooked up with Johnny Z, with Megaforce Records, and he was probably one of the strongest of the independents at the time, and he pushed them. He pushed them like, crazy.
The only thing that frustrates me is the majors did get involved with heavy metal music. It certainly isn't the music that Marsha and I developed back in '83, which was really cool. It was sort of a psychedelic, aggressive kind of a heavy metal music, speed metal, thrash, whatever you want to call it. But Metallica and Anthrax were certainly, and still are today, ahead of their time. Marsha and I pretty much know what the Megaforce sound is. In fact, we have the bands that deliver the Megaforce sound.
That we've been known for, that heavy metal Megaforce sound.
That crunch.
At that time, it was just exploding. They got their demo out early, so a lot of people from all the underground had already heard about them. They probably put out 2,000 demos, worldwide, through the tape trading. It's a nice little network, and I think by doing that groundwork and then just being pushed and having the records, on the shelves, when they did, it just really took off. And they, and then of course they got on good tours, early on, and they were out there. You got to get as much exposure as you can,
It just exploded in the underground. They toured extensively across the states, and and got Kill 'Em All was doing like 65,000 copies worldwide, and on a tiny little label, that was really, really good.
Prior to Kill 'Em All, metal was heavy metal. It was kind of this, like a rock. It was this thing that lived in the ground, and you banged your head to it, and it was a bit beery and a bit kind of staid even. It wasn't overly exciting. With Kill 'Em All, you have this kind of infusion of energy, which for a want of a better word, you might describe as being punk. So it wasn't heavy metal, it was metal. It was much sharper, you could cut yourself on it, and it was a bit volatile. The band themselves were volatile. Hetfield was volatile. And it's easy now to read this into it as you look back, because you see the things that happened to Metallica and the things that Metallica became. But that kind of energy and that kind of determination is evident in the music.
Come on, everybody! Give it!
Well, by comparison to what they did since, Kill 'Em All sounds pretty, it's unpolished. It isn't the fully finished Metallica beast. But yeah, when it did come out, it did shake up the metal community a little bit. It wasn't out of what they were used to. It was the usual kind of tales of war and death, and the usual extremity you'd expect from that scene. But there was a certain amount of depth to it, and it did show where Metallica were going to be going in future.
I'd seen them live a couple of times, in clubs in London. It was see 2 or 3 numbers, go to the bar. Once you'd seen 2 or 3 numbers, you'd kind of seen it all. At least that was my view. They were kids. They were really young, really pimply, really long-haired. They thought the longer the song, the louder the song, the more kick it would be. But these were very early days. Their crowd was very easily pleased. Thrash metal was a brand new phenomenon, in the same way that punk rock was when the Sex Pistols were doing clubs and colleges. You were kind of absolutely madly into it, or it didn't really mean a great deal. They were a huge hit with fanzines. These days it would have been the internet and websites supporting them. Back then it was fanzines, small metal magazines. In Britain, Kerrang! Magazine was the first national magazine anywhere in the world to put them on the front cover or support them. They really were taken
enormously seriously by young fans, young skate kids, thrash metal freaks, but by the critics themselves, the same people that would have been writing about Thin Lizzy or Journey or Iron Maiden in those days. They weren't on the radar whatsoever, and it hurt them a great deal. Lars, Ulrich the drummer, very much the leader of the group and very much a music press devotee, was keenly aware of the fact that Metallica weren't written about in the right places, weren't taken seriously in the right places. You know, the very first album that they recorded was originally called Metal Up Your and featured a fist coming out of a toilet with a sword in it, and they thought that was hilarious.
It wasn't immediately obvious to everyone that either Metallica or thrash metal were forces to be genuine forces to be reckoned with, whether they had any staying power. I think some people actually considered Metallica to be a bit of a joke, but certainly on reflection it didn't take long for people to realise the quality of that album, that there were really some very strong songs there, as well as a very, very energetic sound, which really hadn't, I don't think anybody had quite heard anything like that before.
I can remember we did an initial pressing of 3,000 for the whole of Europe, and we didn't sell half of them in the first month. And I'm thinking, oh, holy I've really stuffed this one.
At the time that Kill 'Em All came out, a lot of heavy metal was just about Dungeons and Dragons, and it was quite boring, it was quite cliched. It was becoming a bit embarrassing for a bit more of the intelligent side of heavy metal, so I think what Metallica did was dust the cobwebs off heavy metal, and that album was kind of a blueprint of where they would go.
You have to really put it into context and perspective. Yes, we'd had Iron Maiden come through. Yes, we'd had the new wave of British heavy metal. Yes, we'd had the birth of a new form of extreme metal, thanks to bands such as Venom. But Metallica really took everything into a new arena. And the reason is simple: songs. Every track stands out. That's what made it a landmark debut. Songs, crucial songs that people remembered, and as soon as they heard the title, a medley and a melody came into the mind, as well as a heavy-duty riff.
Kill 'Em All was a collision of styles that had never really happened before. It was the old school metal, but it was also it also had the energy of punk and the speed of punk rock and hardcore, and it also had the kind of that nasty, scuzzy, playing in sweaty shitholes kind of vibe to them, and Metallica had that in spades. They were obviously, swilling booze like maniacs, and they were all about, taking speed and going berserk, and you could hear that on the record. It was a dirty rock and roll record, but it was, thrash metal is the phrase that absolutely defines what it was all about.
It was a turning point in the metal genre because it was so fast and it was so raw. And a lot of people found that a little bit hard to take, actually. Some people thought it wasn't polished enough. Some people thought it wasn't refined enough. On the other hand, a lot of people got really into it because it was just so fast and so heavy.
It just tapped all the touchstones that defined the genre. Just like the downstroke chucking guitars, the finger shredding leads, like the shouted vocals. I mean, just like James Hetfield was no operatic vocalist. I mean, he was like a punk singer, singing those kinds of things. The only difference was they weren't 3-chord melodies. There was something far more complex and aggressive. And so I think in a way, it wasn't as groundbreaking as I think a lot of people want to believe it was. It simply crystallized the sound, and it gave people a launching off point. Once they heard that, they knew what they should try to emulate if they wanted to be a thrash band.
Goddamn whiplash!
Basically what they were doing was just knocking out a load of metal cliches. James himself admitted this later on, that the lyrics on Kill 'Em All were just tosh. In Whiplash, there's the line, "Bang your head against the stage like you never did before. Make it ring, make it bleed, make it really sore." Which tells you something about the level of songwriting in 1982.
Primitive and gritty, that it immediately connects with an audience. You can bang your head to it, and you know that at some point James Hetfield's going to shout Whiplash, and then the solo kicks in and everybody goes berserk and starts throwing their pints around,
It had a crazy guitar solo in that Kirk Hammett just unleashed from nowhere. It doesn't come in at a normal point in a song, it just hits you when you're not quite expecting such guitar work to kick in, and it really throws you, and because of that you just want to let rip yourself and do some air guitar work.
Sometimes with Slayer they tended to lose the melody in a lot of dense heaviness. Metallica never lost sight of the fact that what made a song happen was it stayed in people's minds, and Whiplash is a part of that. They do go for the blurring solos, they do go for hyper speed, but beyond all that there was a discipline and a melody.
You can only go so fast before you become just like a blur or like a drill or something. So and to actually still have any really serious musical quality, you can't really go that much faster than Whiplash. I would be very surprised if Metallica went through a whole tour and didn't play the likes of the Four Horsemen, Whiplash and Seek and Destroy. I mean, those are songs that will get, 50,000 people at a festival going mad because everybody knows them. And even though the album didn't, obviously the album sold really steadily over the years, and everybody knows those tracks now, and they're heavy metal classics.
Well, Seek and Destroy is kind of like an anthemic heavy metal song, basically. You can bang your fist in the air, you can headbang to it if you have hair. It's a bit of a no-brainer as a song, really, but what it does is it's a rebel-rousing anthem, really, for a tortured youth almost. You can bang your head, you can shake your fist, and throw the devil horns at it.
Seek and Destroy!
The actual song itself is intriguing because it's about someone who goes out looking for fights, and people often mistake it for some sort of militia track, a military action and attitude. It's not. It's really about people who go out looking for fights after they've got slightly drunk or gone into other things.
Funnily enough, it was one of the songs that saw him evolve a bit as a frontman. He was quite unconfident before that, but when he had a bit that he could sing along with and get the audience to get involved with, it did him a lot of good as a performer.
Above all else, I mean, it's a very, very catchy song, and I think it kind of proves that Metallica always had a really good ear for sort of catchy riffs and melodies right from the beginning. So although they were very extreme, they sounded very extreme in 1983, there were still some sort of classic rock moves on the album. And Seek and Destroy is just a really simple sort of chugging riff.
Metallica always did killer choruses. There's numerous songs on Kill 'Em All that have got huge choruses and anthemic choruses, stuff that they're still playing those songs live now because they work so well in a live setting. Seek and Destroy being the obvious one, and Hit the Lights, I suppose, and Whiplash as well. They're all things that people can bellow along after a few beers. Which were maybe some of the later thrash bands, the bands that followed after them. Although there's always stuff you can shout along to. They weren't They weren't melodically strong, a lot of those bands. It was more about the speed and the aggression, whereas with Metallica, the song was always paramount, even when they were playing at 100 miles an hour.
The other thing was, if you listen to that record, yes, it's got the fast and furious riffing, but you immediately hear a little bit of light and shade. There's a bit of tone there. They weren't just going straight for broke, sprinting all the way through. They knew you had to have a balance. The highs are only high if there are lows to emphasize how good those highs really are. But the fact is, it defined the genre because it was head and shoulders above the genre, not because they were the first.
I don't think Kill 'Em All is their best album, but it's got a spirit to it that people really identified with, and they did come fully formed. Their sound, the Metallica sound, was there from day one. So it is a really, really strong record, and there aren't many better debuts or more influential debuts than that.
Kill 'Em All was fast and raw, but Metallica, and in particular James and Cliff, were rapidly developing as songwriters, and it was clear that their music wouldn't confine itself to the thrash metal style for long. After tours with Raven and Venom, they returned to Lars Ulrich's home country of Denmark to record their next album, Ride the Lightning.
Ride the Lightning was a completely different situation for them. Johnny Z by that time had kind of run out of money. So we stepped in and said, all right, well, we'll pay to record it. And we set them up in Denmark in this little studio with Flemming Rasmussen, I think his name was. But a few weeks went by and I hadn't heard anything, so on the phone I spoke to Lars. And he kept saying, no, everything's great, man, everything's great. We're on course, it's fantastic. And then another couple of weeks went by and I'm thinking, well, they must be, getting on for finish now. So I said, have you got any roughs you can send me over? Not exactly. And I thought, I don't like the sound of this. So I got on a plane to Denmark. And the first thing I discovered was that there was an elephant beer dispenser in the reception. So my suspicions were aroused immediately. And when I went in, they were still getting a drum sound. And this was 6 weeks into it. We ended up sort of kicking some ass and sort of having some conversations, etc. And then they got on with it. And so by the time Ride the Lightning was finished, it was actually a stunning record. I mean, a stunning record. And it was kind of a turning point for them and a benchmark for a lot of other bands.
Given the fact that we're talking about a year, literally, between the first Metallica album, Kill 'Em All, in 1983, and the second one, Ride the Lightning, in 84, it's astonishing what a leap they've made.
Maiden and Priest were making great albums around then, but Metallica suddenly sounded like the best metal band in the world when Ride the Lightning came out. That was the difference. And their contemporaries, which, Megadeth and Slayer and Anthrax, were just getting started at that point. And Metallica were kind of going, bye.
They had grown into their reputation, and straight away, as with all leaders of a genre, they superseded it. They outgrew it.
Ride the Lightning was a massive step forward from Kill 'Em All, and what's most remarkable about that is that they recorded it only a year later. So the growth in their music in that time was astonishing. It was a real seismic leap. The difference, I think, was that Kirk Hammett had now been in the band long enough to exert his own influence on the band, which was a considerable one, and they had had many successful tours across the USA. But really, they just came together and they began to develop their music. It became more epic, it became more structured.
They took it to another level on this set on Ride the Lightning. The lyrics were a little better, the production was a little better, the songs were a bit more aggressive than on the first one. I just think from beginning to end, it's a great record.
If one bears in mind the recording budgets which they were working to, this was before they had big, huge management. It was before they had a major label representation. So it would have been done cheaply, on the fly. It is a really tight and impressive record. Some of the songs, many of the songs, still hold up today. Creeping Death being one, For Whom the Bell Tolls being another, Trapped Under Ice, Call of Cthulhu. It is a fabulously good record.
I think the thing is with Ride the Lightning, when you first hear it, it is a stunning kind of movement forward, and listening to it in retrospect since and hearing what all they've done since, it does kind of deaden that shock value. But with things like For Whom the Bell Tolls as well, this massive sound, the kind of Ennio Morricone soundscapes with Ernest Hemingway, it's just everything about it is huge, it's massive, and that's the thing. But then again, you had it set against the subtleties of Call of Cthulhu, and that's where Metallica really stand out from the crowd. It's just the crescendo sounds so much more powerful because of the respites you get with the quiet passages, which you don't get with a lot of metal bands, and that's why I guess Ride the Lightning was another watershed moment for metal. That's the one where you really start to see that there is a lot more to this band than just another thrash band.
While Ride the Lightning was a masterpiece, some fans were concerned by the direction Metallica took with the acoustic ballad Fade to Black. For the first time, the band were faced with accusations of selling out to a more commercial direction.
I think Fade to Black shows where Metallica are going. At the time, it shows where they could go. You know, it shows that there's a different kind of direction that they could do. Even though it kind of encapsulates all that they're very, very good at, because of the melodic touch, it shows that there is they can speak to a lot more people than there would be. They're not going to be trapped in a scene. This thing could go very, very mainstream.
Metallica always had the thrash element in the 80s, but they added different light and shade, different diversity, different styles. They did an instrumental, Call of Cthulhu, on Ride the Lightning. But most important, they did Fade to Black. And I remember just before Ride the Lightning came out, they just finished the album, interviewing James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich for the very first time in London, talking about the album, which I hadn't heard at the time. And James saying, we've done a ballad. And then he looked to the ceiling and said, I don't know how our fans are going to take to us doing a ballad. It's not really what they want from us, is it? But we've done a ballad, and we're very proud of it. And Lars actually was a lot more bullish, saying, you know what, this is Metallica. If they're Metallica fans, will understand what it's all about. It's still intense, it's still heavy, it's just not super fast. So immediately, you had this Metallica do a ballad shock? What is this? Are they gone folk?
It's hard to imagine Metallica recording a song called, like Fade to Black on Kill 'Em All. At that point, I think if anyone had suggested, let's do a song that has really prominent acoustic guitars at the beginning, and it's a kind of meditation on suicide and, you know, misery and all the rest of it, that couldn't have happened on the first album because they were still going, yeah, we're a metal band, come on! And on Ride the Lightning, they were still doing that, but they'd grown up just enough to be able to get away with doing something like that.
Back then, in 84, extreme metal bands weren't writing anything remotely that would fall into the sort of rock power ballad category. And although it isn't really what you call a ballad, it certainly has a sort of quiet bit, which was people weren't really expecting. Quite a lot of quiet.
Drifting further every day, getting lost within myself. Nothing matters, no one else.
I think they did. I don't think even now any other band can do ballads the way Metallica do them. I mean, a lot of bands do ballads and it just sounds totally cheesy, but Metallica do it still sounds heavy, you know what I mean, and emotional in a good way.
And the thing is, because it's still quite raw as well, at that time before James Hetfield's actually, like, his vocals get, not that his vocals are, but his vocals are good on it, but before he's obviously come into like big time producers, and they've made his vocals sound so much better, and he's got vocal lessons and whatever, or anything like that, and it's excellent, you know what I mean, it keeps it that raw vein sounding really good.
They kind of allowed themselves a freedom with their style very early on, which enabled them to do something like Fade to Black without anyone going, well, that's a bit sissy. You know, no one's thought that at the time. Everyone just sat there with their jaw on the floor going, I mean, that's one of the best things I've ever heard in my life. They could bring an atmosphere and bring a feeling to metal songs that other bands wouldn't have been able to grasp what they were doing. And I don't think it was something they sat around and thought about. It's an instinctive, intuitive thing that Metallica had. You know, they were great songwriters and great musicians, but they just had an instinctive feel for what made metal work. And in the same way that Judas Priest and Iron Maiden also had those same gifts, Metallica just took it to another level because they were just heavier, you know, and yet they could play the most delicate, lilting bit of acoustic guitar in Fade to Black, or do a really slow drop-down bit where there's hardly anything happening in Creeping Death, and the crowd's going, die, die, you know, do something as simple as that. And yet it sends shivers down your spine, whereas other bands would just blast away at 100 miles an hour, and, you know, as brilliant as that can be, it's, you know, you can't argue with class, really, and Metallica had lots of class.
Well, it's always been a live favourite, Creeping Death. Well, it's got that really good audience participation bit. We all know it. Die by my hand, all of that. So you get 50,000 Gumbies all giving it that all the time. It's a little bit Nuremberg rally, but it's pretty damn good fun.
And then it had this riff in it which was highly catchy. It wasn't quite thrash, but it certainly wasn't mainstream metal. If anything, it had more in common with Iron Maiden than other metal bands of the day like Sabbath and whoever.
Come on, then!
It actually took an Exodus song, Die by the Sword. Now, Exodus were the band Kirk Hammett had been in subsequent, prior to joining up with Metallica. And he took that song with him. And they changed a little bit of around, but it was based on that track that Metallica developed, Creeping Death. So in those two terms, it was a song inspired by the Bible and based on a song by one of their closest rivals in the Bay Area at the time.
It's not just you banging it out. It's got a bit more feel to it. And I mean, what a riff! I mean, God Almighty, that is one hell of a riff. And I think that was a song that really, even the people that were slightly sceptical after Kill 'Em All, when people heard Creeping Death, I think, you know, as the single, they were quite shocked because they sort of thought, Christ, I mean, you know, it's a really great song. It flattened just about everything around at that time with the power. So, yeah, it's a great track.
They let the song breathe a lot more, you know what I mean? Like, traditional thrash had just been 100 mile an hour and in your face, and that's great. But I think they maybe took it to a different step, a different view on thrash with that, you know. And just to basically, that's it. I mean, they gave the song space to breathe rather than just being straight down your throat.
It is. It's just like you've got the stabs at the beginning, and then it goes down to it goes back down to the riff, and James Hetfield's playing the riff on his own, and then everybody knows it's about to come in. You know what I mean? And the big tom fill comes in, and it's straight in, and the crowd goes mad. It's a good song for the crowd to go mad.
I think he was very much from the sort of Van Halen school of playing, where it's just like, I mean, it was just sort of just high on the neck, you know, and just like, I'm going to do a widdly bit here, I'm going to do a widdly bit here, and I'm going to squeeze this in. And it's just like, you know, whoa, look at me doing this, you know. It's just like there's a sort of lyricism that he began to achieve, I think, later on, you know. But yeah, then it was really bold and new and obviously incomprehensible to the general record buying public. They'd never heard anything like that.
Creeping Death is a live favourite, always has been, always will be. For Whom the Bell Tolls has to be. You can't go and see Metallica and not hear that song. That song is tremendous.
I'll tell you what's cool about For Whom the Bell Tolls is it's got a big ominous sounding tolling bell at the beginning of it. Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath, Hell's Bells by AC/DC, For Whom the Bell Tolls by Metallica. There you go. That's why it's one of the coolest metal songs of all time. You stick a big bell going bong at the beginning of a metal song, it sounds cool.
It was based on the Ernest Hemingway story, which is very much a love story about things that don't work out right. And apparently it was introduced into the band by Cliff Burton. Cliff thought it might be a great idea to write a song around that particular story. And because it's an epic story, Metallica constructed an epic poem. It's a tone poem in many respects. And I don't think it's overestimating what it does. It's a great metal piece, but it's a tone poem with lots of different things going on.
As a song, it's quite basic, it's quite repetitive, but it kind of works on that level that it is quite a basic song, repetitive, and like any hit single, I guess, it becomes lodged in your head for some reason or other, and it's almost the simplicity of it combined with the heaviness of it for what it is that works.
was all in E, the bottom tone that Metallica always used. And it pointed directly at the sort of stripped-down songwriting they'd employ later on for the Black Album and after that. And that's one reason why it's such a live anthem. It's simple, everybody knows it. It's a short song, it's easy to digest. It's one of the epic songs on Ride the Lightning for sure.
What has made Ride the Lightning so popular with Metallica fans is the overall, the whole, which is greater than the sum of the parts. It's a very well constructed album that to this day you put on and you listen to it and you think, Kill 'Em All, the first album, was very primitive and raw. The production really doesn't stand out anymore. The songs come through. Ride the Lightning still sounds, if not quite state of the art, not that far off.
In that crucial time between sort of Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, Metallica were seen as being a rapidly rising cult metal band. They were the band that everyone was talking about, the press, the media, the fans. They just hadn't quite broken through to the level where they were headlining their own tours, but it seemed inevitable.
Ride the Lightning had initially come out on Megaforce, but after 3 months it had been picked up by Elektra, and really they put their weight behind it. And consequently, by the end of the year, you know, it sold 500,000 copies, so they were quite big. In the States they were doing great guns. And then they came over here and played Donington in '84. And this was the occasion when it's kind of known that there were loads and loads of pig parts thrown on stage at Metallica. And most people kind of think of it, oh, somebody threw a pig's head on stage. But since speaking, I spoke to James about it, and he said that by the end of the show, they had enough pig parts on stage that they could have essentially put together a complete animal, because so much of this pork had been thrown at them. I don't know, it's a sign of appreciation, I think.
By 1986, Metallica were riding a wave of critical and commercial popularity. A new wave of American thrash metal bands had risen up in their wake.
And I think they put thrash metal and Bay Area in general on the map. I mean, before that, Bay Area was always, before that known for like what Grateful Dead and Hayden Ashbury, the hippies, and that was like the first. Metallica put it on the map as as something other than that. It's like the Bay Area riffing, the Bay Area metal, to where everybody started talking about it. Every record company wanted to sign a Bay Area band. They don't care what they sound like, as long as they're from Bay Area and they got the Bay Area riffing or whatever. So in a way, it's like the success always kind of kills, because you top out and then it dies out. Every band was signed, it was like a stock market crash, it's where everybody got in, and then there's nobody else left to do anything, and it got so oversaturated, boring, nothing was being created, and there was something brewing up there in Seattle, and that was the new thing, So, yeah, and the record companies, how they switch where they can make a buck, so.
Metallica's finest hour for many fans was Master of Puppets, their heaviest, most complex, and best produced album yet.
What they've already done with the first two albums, which is pretty well put a very underground form of music onto the edge of the mainstream, they go right onto the mainstream with this one. This is one that turns on like masses of people onto rock music.
People either really love Metallica or thought they were too commercial now.
They're all over mainstream media. This is big. This proper big records.
This year, Metallica reached the top 30 with their album Master of Puppets, and Anthrax, Slayer, and Megadeth each released records on a major label for the first time.
We're sort of like one step. We're like furthest out in like left field, pretty much from the middle of any of the sort of bigger heavy metal bands today. Sort of as unsafe as you can get. and we get away with it.
Master! Well, even just before, it was a few months earlier, it was August of '85, actually, Metallica played A Day on the Green, where they were in between, they played with Rat, Y&T, the Scorpions.
And Yngwie Malmsteen, Rat, and Y&T, a bunch of poser bands. And Metallica was second on the bill. But it was interesting because in order to get one of the photo passes that they had, I had to do their dishes. They actually had me do their dishes. So they had me do their dishes, I had to take out the garbage, do a couple other chores around the house. But it was a great show. I got really, really drunk, and I was so excited. It was like the biggest show I'd never been backstage at a huge festival like that. I got some great shots on there. That's all the best outdoor ones I got. But yeah, that was so much fun. I mean, I can't even describe, and that was probably that was 20 years ago.
That was Metallica's first big step, I think, into the mainstream, especially out here in America. You know, they were exposed to a total mainstream crowd. And then Master of Puppets came out, and almost instantly they were put on tour with Ozzy Osbourne. And that's where things come out. Everybody was jumping on the bandwagon. Everybody was walking around wearing a Master of Puppets shirt and thinking it was their first album.
For me, it's the most creative of their attempts. It's just awesome. There's a lot of Cliff in that record, and just the textures of the rhythms. It's just phenomenal. It's an awesome sounding record, and I just love the songs. There's just great songs on that record.
Elektra loved the album, and we were doing some other business with Elektra at the time with bands like Rogue Mail and all sorts of things. So we had a whole load of deals going on with them at the time. And they said, well, look, I'll tell you what, you paid for the last one. We'll pay for the next one and give you the European rights for free. Oh, okay. So we got Master of Puppets for free. And Master of Puppets was the one that kicked it big time.
They delivered the best album of their career at the time when they needed to. They needed to make a brilliant record that didn't alienate all the fans that were going to put their records into the top 5, because they were the world's biggest cult band when that album was released, when Master of Puppets was released. And by the end of that touring cycle, they were just one of the biggest metal bands in the world.
It redefined thrash again, and it raised the bar for thrash again. And it came out in the same year as Rain in Blood by Slayer, and both those albums made everyone else look like a bunch of it's just absolutely made a mockery of everyone else's efforts, because this is what metal in the mid-80s is supposed to be about, and everyone else was kind of left going, yeah, okay, what are we supposed to do now? We're not going to be able to top that.
After 5 years on the road, Metallica now seemed to be on their way to the very top. But tragedy awaited them. On September 27, 1986, the tour bus they were in crashed on a mountain road in Sweden. Bass player Cliff Burton was killed at the tender age of 24.
That was really intense. I was at the house that morning when we got the call, and we thought it was Kirk, because we just heard his mom. She was very upset on the phone, and then she told us it was Cliff. And it hit really hard. Cliff was a great guy, and it affected a lot of people, not just the band, but I mean, he had a lot of tight friends in the Bay Area, and I think him and James were just they were like this. And he was really, really affected, and it took him a long time.
Oh, Cliff was the great. I mean, I think if Cliff was still alive, Metallica would be different as people. He's the one that you could tell how this is, slowly the success started getting to them, and Cliff was the only one that was always kind of keeping them grounded, to where he's like, don't let it get to you. And James looked up to Cliff too. So there was a little bit of a tuggle going on too, because Lars is more of a flashy kind of guy. He's like, the rock star. And Cliff is more pure music, like people's kind of guy, And then there's a tuggle going on, and James is in between. James is, could be pulled either way. And then it was just the Lars and James team. And Lars always felt, it was that Cliff was in the way. I know he would never admit it, straight out, and it would be a bad thing for him to do so. But it was, because James really looked up to Cliff.
We all spoke to them, And I'm sure Johnny Z spoke to them as well, because he was probably still closer to them than anybody. I know I spoke to them, but it was very much a decision that they had to come to themselves, and they took some time off to decide what they were going to do. But I always had the feeling that it was touch and go, and that it could have gone either way. And these things happen. I mean, these things happen to a lot of groups. And one thing goes, obviously in this case, it's something that went tragically wrong. I mean, it can't go worse.
They completely changed after he left, which is one of the reasons why Master of Puppets is still so highly regarded, still so affectionately thought of by their fans, because once Cliff was gone, everything about that group changed. Suddenly Lars and James are now the soul of the group. They're not just the writers and the career decision makers. They're the glue, they're the soul, they're the vibe, they're the direction. And up until then, it had absolutely been Cliff. There's a school of thought that argues that if they hadn't lost him, they may not have become as hugely successful as they did, because there was a line in the sand that Cliff drew which he wouldn't cross, and he wouldn't allow those guys to cross. And one of those would be, for instance, releasing 5 singles from an album, which is what they went on to do just a few years later. Making videos, cutting their hair short, wearing makeup, all the stuff that Metallica went on to do in the 90s really wouldn't have happened if Cliff had still been there.
A mere month after Cliff's death, a new bassist was recruited. Jason Newsted, formerly with the B-League thrash metal band Flotsam and Jetsam, was suggested to Metallica by their old friend Brian Slagle, and after auditions of both his playing and his drinking ability, was asked to join the band.
Cliff died midway through the Master of Puppets tour. It was in Scandinavia, so they still had quite a lot of dates that they were yet to finish there. When Jason was confirmed as the new bass player, they went back and actually played all of those shows that they hadn't played, that were still on the itinerary. And that was a really brilliant move by them, because it was a way of breaking Jason in a low-key manner. It wasn't like they were coming out with a new album and they were going on a massive tour. It was, here's the new guy, we're doing a few shows, and we're also honouring our commitment to our fans, which I thought was amazing, considering nobody would have minded had they said, well, we won't do those shows now. Nobody was going to kick up a fuss. It was a really good idea for them the way they brought Jason in that way, and it got everybody excited and on board ahead of what was to come.
I don't know exactly why they got him. Maybe he fit in personnel-wise or personality-wise the best. I mean, I like Jason. He's a nice guy too.
It was tough for Jason to come in and fill the spot, you know, not even comparing them as players, but as just even a personality. I think that was more than anything, you know, because their styles are different. You know, and Jason does his thing, Cliff was great in his own way, but the personality, you just couldn't, you know, you couldn't match that.
If you want to make comparisons between him and Cliff, he's more of like a picking bassist and stuff like that, which is fine, I guess, but if you had come from someone like Cliff, who is like all fingers and just everywhere, I'd think you'd want to carry that on.
Despite the constant bullying Jason received in his early months in Metallica, the new lineup gelled, and their first music together appeared in the summer of 1987 on the Garage Days Revisited EP, recorded in Lars's garage in San Francisco.
It's so strange, isn't it, that Metallica, subsequent to Cliff Burton dying, got in a new bassist, and the first thing they did was a covers EP with Diamond Head, Budgie, Misfits, and I think it actually was a very cunning and very clever move, because to go straight into the studio and do a new record with all new songs would have put an enormous amount of pressure onto Jason Newsted's shoulders. They introduced him into the Metallica way of doing things by doing something very different.
It was a slightly unusual move, partly because of the songs that they covered. They covered songs from the new wave of British heavy metal. There was a song by Holocaust, there was a one by Diamond Head, but there was also a Killing Joke song as well, so there was something of Cliff's punk and post-punk influences going on there.
I've been to Woodstock too. So what? So what?
You know, that's them just showing everyone where they come from, in the same way that Bread Fan is as well. Budgie, a very underrated band, not really very liked because they've had a really stupid sounding singer and lots of very, very bizarre song titles like Hot as a Docker's Armpit and In the Grip of a Tire Fitter's Hand. So they weren't the most obviously commercial band ever, but they were quite good.
Bread Fan shows to me that when Metallica want to, how they can improve their version of a song over the original if they want. The original Bread Fan was a great song, but it wasn't recorded particularly with an awful lot of budget and an awful lot of aggression. When Metallica did it, their version was amazing. It was absolutely incendiary. It was really, really fast, really, really precisely played, and it has this old school, slightly bluesy element because the riff is based on a bend.
Bread Fan's a weird one because it is more simplistic and it is more bluesy than the kind of thing you'd expect them to do. But it sounds perfectly natural. I mean, I think there's other stuff that they've covered that doesn't sound particularly natural, but they were obviously having fun doing it. So you kind of go, oh well, you know, it's a laugh listening to them doing it. But a great song, you know. Kurt plays a brilliant solo in that one. It's very, you know, it's quite simple, quite rock and roll, quite bluesy. But it sounds like, you know, it does sound like Metallica.
And because he wasn't trying to emulate the solo at the time by a guy called Tony Ball, he did it in his own way. And because he did it in his own way, he put his own stamp on it, while strangely enough also paying an enormous amount of respect to the way the original sounded. So he did a really good job of crossing that bridge, because you want a cover to sound enough like the original to recognise it, but sufficiently individual so it doesn't just sound like a note-for-note copy. It's not mimicking, it's emulating.
After this promising start, it was a surprise that when the next full Metallica album, And Justice for All, appeared in 1988, it contained almost no bass. James and Lars had asked the mixers to remove it almost completely. Add to this the fact that the album was too technical in its arrangements for most fans, and it's clear that something of a crossroads was approaching for Metallica.
There are reasons why people don't regard it with quite the same level of, you know, of love and kind of hysterical enthusiasm that they do Master of Puppets, and the production is one, you know, that clicky kick drum sound, which is actually quite irritating. The fact that you can't hear the bass guitar. It's a very stripped down album in some ways, and because the songs are actually more progressive and more complex and more kind of self-indulgent than anything they've done before, if it had had the production that Master of Puppets or Ride the Lightning had, a bigger, warmer, you know, fuller sound, perhaps it wouldn't, you know, it would have been as revered as Master of Puppets.
It was decided, and I use "it was" rather than the band decided, because I'm not convinced they ever went along with it wholeheartedly, but it was decided that Mike Klink, who'd worked with Guns N' Roses on Appetite for Destruction, should be the guy to produce what was to be And Justice for All. And they went into the studio and it did not work. And they spent ages trying to make it work, and eventually ran out of money and ran out of time, or came close to running out of both. And they did the only thing that was logical. They ran back to the guy they understood, Flemming Rasmussen, and said, "Help! We need to make an album, and fast, and not much money, because a lot of the budget has gone on things we're never going to use. So there's a feeling of rushing it. And I think that's part of the reason why the bass is so low, because I think they rushed everything and probably didn't realise at the time the bass is fairly heavily mixed down. You can't hear Jason Newsted.
There is no bass on that album. Where it is the biggest question in Metallica's career that everybody asks, and there is no answer. Jason Newsted obviously plays bass on it. You see the songs live and there are bass lines, but in way of production it was certainly not there.
I interviewed Jason a couple of years ago for my book, and he told me that while Justice was being mixed, it had been recorded, while it was being mixed they were touring on the Monsters of Rock thing with Van Halen and the rest of them, and in between shows James and Lars were driving down to the studios where the album was being mixed. And at one point they said to the mixers, take the bass down to where you can barely hear it and then knock a dB off the top of that as well. So I said to Jason, well, why would they do this? You know, you're a great bass player. And they said they had a multitude of reasons. One of them was they weren't too confident about his skills when he was replacing Cliff. Secondly, there was a slight click because his plectrum was hitting the strings, but that's stupid because you can take that out anyway in the production. So it would seem simply that they didn't really want his presence too high on the album, or you could spin it the other way and say that the guitar sound which James had used on the album was so vast that in fact it was appropriate to take up the bass frequency space. But it's endlessly debatable.
They're all very, very good compositions, but they're all very uncomfortable. And I think that's the point that people make these days with Justice for All. It's not a happy album, it's not a pleasant album, and it's an album that you feel a little bit like you want to back away from.
On Unjustice for All, you got the first fruits of, the first signs that James Hetfield was beginning to sing about himself a bit more, particularly on Dyer's Eve, which is about his horrendous childhood. Now, how appallingly his dad, would treat him, and that he had quite religious parents, and how, the dim view they took of everything that James Hetfield stood for, and how he felt that he was a disappointment to them, and how they were cruel to him, and all this kind of stuff, The
lyrics on Unjustice for All, for the first time, were political. They didn't really allude directly to any particular institutions or organisations, but it was apparent that rather than singing about Satan and all those ridiculous cliches as they had done on early records, they weren't singing about biblical plagues in Egypt anymore. They were singing about subjects much closer to home.
You're beginning to get a more kind of an angry, more personal Metallica coming through, and you've got something like One, which is obviously one of the most harrowing things that they've ever written about. It's in some respects One is a kick metal song, but if you actually read the lyrics and try and put yourself in the mind of the character in One, there isn't anything more horrific than that, really.
One is the standout track. It starts off with the helicopters and the machine guns, leads into something very doomy, which they borrowed and inspired by a Venom track called Buried Alive, and then slowly opens up into this huge grey anthem. And grey is what really, colours is the wrong word, what really shades it and makes One such a magnificent track that to this day is such a crucial part of their live set.
Lars' drumming at the beginning of One, when it's the kind of mellow acoustic part, is a bit heavy-handed, shall we say. And I think some producers would not have mixed his kick drum and snare quite as loud as they did on One, because it is kind of like, they're playing these beautiful harmonies and stuff on the guitars, and then there's this bloke hitting biscuit tins in the background, which doesn't help, But I don't think there's anything wrong with his drumming per se on it. I think it's just the way it's mixed. It's just not, it is a bit, a bit ham-fisted, really.
Lars has never been credited as being the best drummer ever. Nonetheless, that shouldn't take away from the fact that he is a highly competent drummer. One thing that does annoy a few people is that occasionally he doesn't know when to lay back and take it easy. An example might be the first section of One, which is supposedly a melodic, sort of quiet section. He could have laid off a little bit. There's another song on Reload called Unforgiven 2, which is extremely quiet and mellow in its first section, and Lars is all over the place hitting the snare. He could really have done some rim shots or something just to keep it down a little bit, but that's his style.
But you actually listen to this song and it's so claustrophobic. It's about someone who's alive inside, who can't communicate. And there is an element there of James Hetfield, because I think to some extent he was alive inside, but couldn't actually feel he could communicate his despair, and the fact he was slowly falling into the trap of allowing his demons to come out. I believe Unjustice for All is a confused record. It's a band who are angry because Cliff Burton had died. It's a band who are depressed because of that, but a band who are also determined. There's a real feeling sometimes of tracks like Harvester of Sorrow, which is about a drug addict who kills his own family. That's a bit shocking sometimes. It's not a happy album.
Harvester of Sorrow is quite pedestrian. It plods along. You can understand why it was released as a single. You can understand why people like it live, but realistically, it's just a bit average.
They should have been writing another Orion, you know, or another Battery or something like that. And instead, it's just this kind of, just really sort of tepid and, you know, generic Metallica song. You know, it's like they didn't want to become formulaic, but I think it was like one of the first signs that Metallica were starting to run out of ideas.
I think we made other people aware that heavier music was out there and it was actually music and that there were people that liked it. Mm-hmm. Whatever's popular doesn't mean it's good, basically. We opened the door, I think, once our underground following was so huge, you know, they wanted to see, they're calling MTV, where's the Metallica video? Who? You know, and radio. They had to pay attention to us. Yeah. And it opened all these doors for grunge stuff, you know. It was more accepted on, you know, now you can't watch TV without seeing a commercial with some, you know, aggressive music in it. True. You know, 10 years ago, I would have flipped out to hear, you know, even if it was just Aerosmith or some kind of rock on the, anything on the TV. But now it's so acceptable, and that's if we've helped open the door, that's fine.
What seems to be happening now a lot in heavy, whatever you want to call it, is that people are so worried about things like guitar players are very worried about, you know, speed and things like that. Drummers are very, you know, play as fast as they can and being as flashy as possible. And I think what is going on is that I think most people sort of care more about those kind of things than an actual feel for the music, which I think is very dangerous. And I think that the current heavy metal scene is really moving away from when I think that it peaked in, you know, 81, 82. I think that bands have no sort of individualities anymore. They have no personalities. They're all just sort of, everyone's just copying what everyone else is doing. Everyone is playing it very, very safe. No one is sort of just taking chances and sort of trying to do things a bit different. But like, I'm really worried about that people are really losing like a feel for the music, which is something that I think through the 60s and the 70s and up to a few years ago, people, you know, the whole thing was very much centered around people's feel for, you know, different instruments and feels for songwriting and so forth.
What do you think is important for an album to come out and become a classic?
Wow. We're still working on that, you know? It's never the best. Never. You can always do it better, and you're never satisfied, which is not a bad thing. You know, you always want to find that perfect thing, you know? And that's what kind of drives you. I think the drive and the will to try new things, to experiment and to push each other.
It was time for a change of direction. In 1990, Metallica had a meeting with well-known producer Bob Rock, who had worked on successful albums by Motley Crue and The Cult. Rock told Metallica that in his opinion, they had never captured on record the intensity of their live shows. After some discussion, Lars and James decided to bring him on board for the next record. It was a decision that would shape their entire career.
It was the end of the line there. There's no way they could go any further down that line. They had to do something radically different. And what they did was reinvented themselves so brilliantly that, I mean, it was a masterstroke, the Black Album.
The last thing you want Metallica to do was keep on releasing the same album, you know what I mean? Because they've never done that, so why would they start? I think it's good, the progression's good.
The progression is good, and it got them a million times more fans, you know, so it's still one of the biggest selling albums. So.
The first 4 albums, it's just Metallica, and it's fantastic, and they were the coolest band on the planet. The Black Album, they weren't our band anymore. You know, as a committed metalhead, they stopped being my band then, and they became loads of other people's band instead.
Let's put it this way. The Black Album, Metallica's big commercial breakthrough, was designed that way. It was tailored to be big. However, I still maintain this is the darkest album they ever made.
Metallica had deliberately avoided the over-complex structures of the songs on previous albums and stripped everything down to its basic components. The critics loved it, although some old-school fans mourned the lack of the speedy thrash metal elements that had made albums such as Kill 'Em All and Master of Puppets so exciting.
A lot of people hate the Black Album, even though it was a very successful one. Even myself, I actually like the Black Album. You know, even though I'm embarrassed to say that I'm among my comrades in the thrash metal community that I hang out with. They had just gone so mainstream. It was just ridiculous how mainstream they were. But you know what? Compared to how they are today, they still had their roots in metal, and it was still a heavy metal record.
They always try to evolve and create something new. I mean, just even from Kill 'Em All to Ride the Lightning, you saw the progression. Ride the Lightning to Master, same thing, you know, into the Black Album. And I think after the Black Album, they kind of got in that comfortable zone.
The point of the Black Album, why it's a great album, is that yes, there are quite a lot of average tracks, but they loaded it up, didn't they, with a load of really, really big songs at the start of the record, and it sounded brilliant as well. Bob Rock did a fantastic job.
What Bob Rock had introduced to the band at that time was not so much the impetus to write stripped down simpler songs. I think that came from James and Lars themselves. But what he did do was beef up sound. There was a full bass presence. He made it radio friendly. You've got to remember he'd worked with people like Motley Crue before he worked with Metallica. He knew how to make an album sound good on MTV through a little TV speaker or on the radio or whatever. So really he facilitated their desire to write simpler songs. People blame Bob Rock for too much. It's not like he sat down with them in the songwriting room and said, you can't do this, you've got to do that. What he did do was give them a very, very nice mainstream sound.
The Black Album is sonically, in one sense, sonically perfect. It's probably got the best production on it of any metal album ever, but it is more pedestrian, it's more middle of the road, it's more commercial, it's more simplistic. In many ways they regressed at that point, because if you look at the songs, they're the most straightforward bunch of songs they'd written since Kill 'Em All. In fact, in some ways more so. They're much more traditional in terms of structure.
They took 10 steps backward, you know, in their songwriting. I mean, it's just, and there's great songs on there. But they no longer were progressing as a creative band, they were progressing as a commercial band.
Brilliant record, but it's not exciting. I think that's the thing, and it should have been, you know. But then would they have sold 14 million albums if they'd you know, done Master of Puppets 2, fast, brutal, progressive? No, they wouldn't have done. They'd have sold about 3 copies.
These are songs about split personalities. These are songs that really do cry out for help. Enter Sandman itself is like that. This is about a man or a person who can't sleep. This is about a man who gets into a different world, a different dimension, a different mindset. because of the nightmares he's having. This is the man who can't actually deal comfortably with what life is doing. That makes it such a dark record for me.
My God, when you heard just the intro, and as soon as the riff came in on Enter Sandman, you knew that they got it back.
We know they're going to play Enter Sandman as an encore because it's the biggest selling record they've ever had, you know, and it is a brilliant song and it does work live, but you listen to the album and it's so glossy and so polished and so overblown and so huge sounding. You can't hope to reproduce that live.
But Enter Sandman's just got everything, hasn't it? I mean, it's just, you know, slightly scary lyrics that make you want to look under the bed. That's a good start. Nice bit of wah-wah from Kirk on the playing there, some nice feel. Great drumming from Lars. You don't hear those words in that order in the same sentence many times, do you? Actually, he's a better drummer than people give him credit for. I mean, come on. I don't think you can be the drummer in Metallica and be rubbish.
Black Album took everybody by surprise. And then when it came out, actually it made complete sense. I don't think anybody expected it to sell as hugely as it did, or to receive as much MTV and radio exposure as it did. But when you look back on it, and it's 15 years ago now, it's the obvious thing for Metallica to have done at that juncture in their careers.
They couldn't have known that grunge was going to hit that big in that year. They couldn't have known that the rock was going to change so dramatically. Nobody did. My God, if they'd have made an album like Justice at the time of the grunge hitting, they could have been in real trouble because they would have looked like some, you know, Led Zeppelin or Yes or something, because it was a very overwrought kind of thing. This, by comparison, was perfect, and it set the album up. I mean, if you want to set an album up with what the new Metallica is all about, I mean, couldn't ask for any better than Enter Sandman.
One of the great things with the Black Album is it allowed James Hetfield for the first time to prove what a great voice he had. He'd done it before, but no one had realised, because it was all locked in with the metal theme and the power, the passion, the energy, the riffs. So that what James did sometimes got a little lost. But on the track like Nothing Else Matters, he suddenly was allowed to sing, and sing with a lot of depth and feeling, and it got through to people who thought, God, that guy doesn't just growl, he can really sing.
You know, and this is the guy who just, you know, just sounded like he was just gonna just murder 1,000 people on Battery a few years before. And then all of a sudden he's just like singing this really weepy and bleeding and slightly embarrassing and absurd adolescent thing about a breakup, you know, that was supposed to happen years before, but, you know, he couldn't remember. You know, I mean, it's just like, who is that supposed to appeal to? Not metalheads. People who wanted to flick their lighter on. People who grew up with Bon Jovi, who grew up with the kind of cock rock and hair metal that thrash was there to destroy, you know? I mean, Bon Jovi was the Antichrist, and Metallica was there to right their wrongs.
They're going to write some big love song, they never are, they never have done, they never will. But they do write some quite moving stuff. And, you know, if you don't think that, then you really weren't there in '93 at Milton Keynes with a bit of a chill in the air, standing with a cigarette lighter above your hand, with everybody singing along. That was quite a moment. Oh.
Sad but true.
Sad but true. First of all, you've got this massive down-tuned guitar riff, but also James has a very sort of staccato, percussive, forceful vocal, which comes through. It's not over-complex. It's basically shouting words like hate, hate, I'm your hate, sort of almost anthemic, repeated sort of way.
Hey, hey, I'm your life. I'm no gonna take you there. Hey, hey, I'm your life. I'm the one.
There's a thing about sad but true that is so less is more. You know, I mean, it's just like you listen to Lars Ulrich's drumming, and it's like doon, 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 doon. You know, just this really, really simple but powerful kind of thing. He didn't have to be doing double kick drum or just like some insane kind of fill or whatever else, you know, because it's just like that's all the song needed.
As the Black Album soared up the charts in dozens of countries around the world, Metallica embarked on a huge tour that lasted 3 years, earning hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue and stamping their identity on the music scene forever. The band were now part of the rock establishment.
We were on the road for bordering on 3 years. The tour was the longest tour we've been on, probably the longest tour anybody's been stupid enough to go on. And it was, but you know what? We had a record that could carry that kind of tour, and it was the right thing to do, and it was the right time to do it. We got a chance to play to a lot of places that we might never go back to. A lot of countries opened up to us. And we came back to places like the UK and Europe and stuff like that 3 times on the run. So it was a great thing. After that, we really were in need of some serious time off for the first time in our career. We really needed to get away from Metallica for a while.
Led Zeppelin song makes the same.
Oh my God, huh? Look at this thing.
Here we go.
I guess these things just went down in value. If we can win one, I guess anybody can, huh?
Yes, and the best metal performance is Roy Rogers.
All right, Roy.
Metallica.
Ho, ho, ho. Couldn't they give us a few more minutes after that? Anyway, let's get on with it. Thank you. You want a job? Let's see. I think the first thing we got to do is, obviously, like you guys were expecting this, we got to thank Jethro Tull for not putting out an album this year, right?
In less than a decade, they had risen from the underground beginnings in the clubs of San Francisco to a position where the world lay at their feet. While the future looked rosy, the pressure of being the biggest metal band in the world was building beneath the surface.
After the enormous Black Album tour, I think Lars and James in particular had started to burn out, and after some time out, they realised that they really needed to think carefully about the future of Metallica. Could they keep on knocking out these thrash metal albums or these radio-friendly heavy metal albums? And in fact, the decision they made when they came back in 1996 with Load was to take an alternative rock direction, which horrified lots of people.
5 years in terms of calendar years, but basically just tons of work, and I think it's gone really quick actually. So there you go.
It seems like just a flash. I mean, I can remember doing the same sort of thing back in 1991. I mean, it's gone by really, really quickly. The whole 5 years, because I mean, it was not like we were just like sitting around, you know, by the pool. I mean, we worked for like, you know, for those 5 years.
I think actually between the Black Album and Load, we kind of got a little bit of an anchor at home, you know. Okay. We got a place to live, you know. Found a girlfriend, you know.
Things
now,
that usual people do sometimes. Huh?
normal things.
Normal things,
yeah, that we really don't know how to do. But Lars and I have since gotten married, not to each other, but we've been married for 14 years. I mean, that's old news. But you know, we found the right woman, you know, and each of us got married.
Here. You got the
Yeah,
ring.
I got the ring. I actually just put it on for the interview.
For the wife to see.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We went in April, the end of April of '95, in Sausalito, California,
yeah.
the record plant, which is pretty close to, really close to Lars' place, close to James. All, you know, within an hour of all of us, basically. That's the first time we've ever recorded at home. We've got to stay in our own beds at night and that kind of thing. Up till now, you know, Denmark or Los Angeles,
Sure.
wherever it happened.
The idea was to do a double CD with all these songs. And we recorded all the drum tracks, and it ended up taking a really long time, and we just knew we wouldn't meet any time schedules. You know, we'd be in the studio for a couple of years. That's not what we want to do.
We worked one notch lesser in terms of the stress level. This was the first record we've ever made at home in San Francisco, and we kind of told ourselves that we would rather the record take, you know, 2-3 months longer and we don't kill ourselves or each other doing it. So this has definitely been the least difficult record for us. I mean, it was difficult and so on, but it was the least difficult and the least stressed out record we've made.
We went in with that idea of doing those 29 songs, right? That this task, can we do this double CD? Get 6 months in, do those drum tracks.
Kirk told me that you recorded drum tracks back in '95, and that
Yeah.
is part of the drum.
Oh,
track.
I remember drum tracks. Yes.
Yeah.
Look at each other, have kind of a team meeting and go, this is not, you know, going to work because we have to have that light up there to see, to go on tour and do all that thing. We want to get out in the summer, not miss the generation of listeners, let people know Metallica's alive and well and kicking. You know, we want to get it going again, get it flowing. So that happened. Decided those 14 songs, came back around, and we moved everything to New York on March 1st, the whole operation, to finish up with vocals and some guitar stuff, and then the mastering.
The material that we had, it basically kind of wrote itself. So a lot of the riffs, we weren't so concerned about, okay, here's a great riff and now we're going to put a bunch of other riffs around it and construct the song certain ways. We just got some just straight ahead great riffs and built on just the one riff and kind of let other things happen around it. Lars and I would take Kirk or whoever's riff, start jamming on it, and then other things would flow out of it. Instead of trying to put all these pieces of a puzzle together, the song kind of helped write itself. And in turn, they got their own feel. There's definitely some greasier stuff on there. Sure. Some more hard edge picking. There's just different, more jamming feels to it all, I think.
When we sit down and make a Metallica record, there isn't a lot of criteria because we're so instinctive.
With Load, you know, it was a whole shock for the company. It was a combination of them all being short-haired and GQ looking, and with the complete change in musical direction that they went into. It seems like Metallica are making excuses. Hey, it's not because of our hair; it's because of our music. I mean, I say it's a big, you know, corporate decision that they made. If they still wore leather jackets, bullet belts, and long hair, MTV wouldn't play their videos. And you know that for a fact. They would have been looked at as some 80s thing, so they went and tried to conform their style and their look to what was accessible for today on MTV, and I guess, you know, they're trying to appeal to a younger audience.
The album Load sold millions, but divided the fans and critics sharply.
I think it was the beginning of the end of the close relationship that Lars and James had enjoyed for, at that point, 15 years, now nearly a quarter of a century since they first met. Lars took time out to become a bit of a trendy, started collecting art, enjoyed the money and fame that went with the huge success of the Black Album. James went off and I think started to self-analyze what he wanted to do. And by the time they got back together to do a record, I think there were two camps within Metallica.
One was James and Jason wanting to do heavy stuff, because that's what Metallica was. The other being Lars, and to a lesser extent Kurt, saying, no, we should continue to explore music. Look what's been going on. Oasis have happened in England. We got Blur, you got all these great bands who are suddenly starting to come out, and we want their influence to show in our music. And I think there was a confusion in the way that Metallica wanted to represent themselves, which is shown in the photos they did for promotion of Load, which had Kirk and Lars in makeup and James and Jason looking very bemused. And I think Load is a very bemused album.
They've kind of gone too far now. It's like they'd almost be making, with Load, it's almost like an effort to make a normal rock record. You know, it's almost like Southern Boogie in parts. It's not right. It's a 3 out of 5 record, whereas like the Black Album been a 5 out of 5 record. Yes, it's still big, still got the sound in the band there, but they're kind of doing styles of music which doesn't suit them necessarily. You know, they come from a scene that was a very underground scene, made it mainstream, and now they're just making normal rock music. And it's the first one where the fans start to get a bit confused, and the fans don't like it as much. It's still a big selling record, but people are not quite so sure about it. People are scratching their heads going, not quite so sure about this, you know.
Its salvation, if it does have a salvation, is that the production is very comfortable and straightforward and easy, and the songs, or more often than not, the songs are good.
Do you get bothered? How do you react? How's your daily life living with this? The opinions.
You know, it doesn't bother me. We laugh a lot at a lot of them. It's pretty interesting to find out what people really think. You know, what they spend their time thinking about is more. You know, there's a lot of really bored people out there that I think overanalyze Metallica. We're 4 guys that like to make music, you know, pretty much.
And they take little things.
Oh, they get out the big glasses and what's going on there?
Metallica didn't seem to care about their detractors' opinions. After all, they'd been through it many times before. But when they released a second album of middleweight rock tunes in 1997 called Reload, even they had to take notice of the fans' opinions. Reload was mediocre at best, and many of Metallica's most loyal followers hated it.
Reload is the second worst Metallica album ever. Now I don't know if this is true, but to me it sounds like the leftovers from Load. Stuff that they had lying around and thought, well, we think it's pretty good, we'll put it together and shove it out.
So is Reload a continuation of Load, musically, spiritually?
Brilliant, yes. Yes, it is.
Me and James wrote about 30 songs, and we went in the studio and recorded 30 songs. So we actually didn't record one album while we were away. We actually basically recorded 2 albums.
Why have you decided to have this connection with these 2 albums? Usually you were doing so much different stuff from album to album, from Ride to...
Well, we wrote all these songs at one time. We wrote 30 songs, and we just didn't finish them all in time for Load to come out. So these are the rest of the songs. They're not the crappier ones. They're not the ones that were, They're the ones that didn't get finished. So we want these songs to come out, and the only time we feel that they have some relevance should be now, you know?
It's just part 2 of the record they'd already done, which people are not quite so sure about. It's not quite the Metallica that people really want, you know.
Fuel, which, although it was an averagely good song, was easily the best song on the album, which I think is quite indicative of the quality of Reload. It was really quite poor. It was almost as if Metallica had lost their enthusiasm.
I'm not quite sure what was in the back of their mind doing Reload. It surely couldn't have been the idea of James and Jason to do it. I suspect they knew they were due a break. I suspect they wanted a break from each other. I also suspect there may have been some record company pressure saying, well, guys, you're supposed to deliver an album in 1999. Well, okay, so I'll tell you what, you got all this stuff left over. Let's make an album from it. But whatever, it was a huge mistake.
Maybe a little better than Load, but it still sucked.
3 years from now, the songs, you know, might not fit us anymore.
But the music is different than Load. It's heavier. We heard like 6 songs today. The music is more, I would say, heavier, more moody.
Okay.
The Load had more straightforward manner.
Yeah, I think so as well. Yeah, Load was a lot more down the middle. It's a wider variety this time as well. Big fat Black Sabbath type songs, stripped down kind of folksy song. I think it's a pretty exciting record. I think it's really fun to work on the songs right now.
Give me fuel, give me fire, give me devil to the side, yeah!
As the decade drew to a close, it seemed that Metallica were on a downhill slide. Although they still went on huge tours and grossed large fortunes, an increasing number of metal fans doubted the quality of their music. In 1998, they released a covers album, Garage Inc., and followed it the next year with S&M, a live album recorded with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. Both sold respectively, but by this stage, it had been almost a decade since the band had released a truly great album.
So what else is happening with the band? Tell me about what's going on.
Just taking a break right now. We're going to be doing a video for a song for the Mission Impossible soundtrack.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, and that's going to be coming out pretty soon. And after that, we're going to take some more time off, and then hopefully get some stuff together, some songs together, and tour this July.
Oh, really? So you're actually going to go out on the road again?
Yeah, we're going to play a handful of dates scattered across the states. And then after that, we're going to take some more time off and then start writing, and hopefully we'll be in the studio by the end of the year. We'll see how that goes.
The final nail in the coffin seemed to come in 2001, when Lars Ulrich outraged literally millions of music fans by announcing that Metallica were suing a file-sharing program manufacturer called Napster.
Essentially, Lars stood out as a figurehead for Metallica. He was protecting their own back catalogue and their own revenue. I think people thought at the time, Lars, you're just trying to save yourself money. But it wasn't really about that. There was money involved. Lars was very, very open about that. He said, yes, we're saving ourselves. Napster are taking away a bit of money from us. But the bigger point here, which people failed to understand, and I think largely do still fail to understand, is that what he was talking about was artists' rights. And the fact that if you're an artist and you create something, you should have control over that thing. It was about control, really. People didn't really understand that, and I think his reputation will never recover from the Napster fiasco.
By the end of 2001, Metallica were in trouble. The Napster case had cost them a lot of fans. Bassist Jason Newsted had left after 14 years, angry that James wouldn't let him play music with other bands.
Are you still, Kirk and Lars, doing most of the music writing?
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Is that the case that Jason does write, or he's a lazy bum, or?
He's definitely not lazy. He takes too many vitamins, actually, I think. Yeah, he's got a strange color. Too much ginseng. But he's, some of the material, the material was written 2 years ago, so yeah. There's not going to all of a sudden be some Jason songs on this because it was written, 2 years ago. When we write songs, we close our eyes, we don't see whose name is on the tape, Yeah. When it's good, it's good, It
works, yeah.
That's how Metallica works. Just growing up together. I mean, that it is family, no doubt. And some of us have strong family lives, some don't. So this is really family for quite a few of us. And to not respect your family is wrong. And we all really keep each other in line. We all keep tabs on each other, with the Metallica sarcasm we have. It really, it's funny, but it cuts and it works.
With relationships much improved in the band, they turned towards the new album. Writing the songs as a collective for the first time, the band found a new aggression and purpose in the music.
It was a bit heavier and a bit faster than what had appeared before, certainly faster than anything that appeared in the 1990s. They'd rediscovered an element of what we call thrash metal. Lars was playing fast snare patterns once again, which hadn't done for a while. But this was true on a couple of songs. It wasn't the case throughout the album.
The original music's far more complex and stranger and much more original than the later records. They've become more of a rock band. In the 90s, they became more of a normal rock band. And St. Anger's an attempt to get out of that, you know.
The most notable thing about St. Anger, and certainly the thing that most people pick up on when they don't like it, is the sound. What Lars did was detune the snares on the side of his snare drum, which means that instead of getting a normal snare sound, you get a kind of boom noise when you hit it, and this is prevalent throughout the album. Now, a lot of people hated this and thought, why have you done this? Why have you gone back to sort of basic garage values? And it all ties in with the fact that Metallica wanted to rediscover some of their early spirit, so it makes sense. Bob used old microphones. He didn't bother tuning James's vocals. You can hear James hit the odd wrong note vocally. And all in all, the album sounded deliberately unsophisticated. This divided the fan base. Some people admired the fact that it was a deliberate hark back. Other people, like me, really couldn't stand it.
St. Anger, I mean, I can't believe Bob Rock did such a great job producing the other albums. Saying it's like the worst production job I've ever heard on any album. It's just, God, what is it? Like, people are calling it, trash can drums. It's just really like you gotta be kidding me. And yeah, the album is faster and heavier and is an angry sounding album, but the songs just aren't that good,
And by and large, the album just didn't have that quality that Metallica had been so insistent on it in their previous records, even on records which were relatively unsuccessful, like Load and Reload. At least you had some melodies, you had some catchy stuff, you had some heavy stuff as well, you had all the Metallica elements. On St. Anger, really, everything sounded very average.
With St. Anger in the can, Metallica concentrated on finding a new bass player.
When Metallica auditioned Jason's replacement, among the people they spoke to, there was Scott Reeder of the stoner rock Caius, who's an amazing player, but perhaps a little bit laid back and not technical enough for Metallica. There was Twiggy Ramirez, who had played with Marilyn Manson's band, a great player, but perhaps he didn't quite have the sort of ballsy energy that they required. And the man they ultimately recruited was Rob Trujillo, who had been in Suicidal Tendencies, and he had his own funk rock side project called Infectious Grooves. Now, what they were looking for in a bass player, I think, was someone who obviously was technically proficient enough to be able to handle it. And in fact, Lars said later of the other guys that he thought the songs were about 10% too difficult for their skills. But also someone who could push them. What James and Lars said about Rob when they recruited him was that he pushes us to achieve. Rob said himself that his ethos in life is to step up, always to take the next step. And when you watch the scene in Some Kind of Monster when Rob is playing his audition, he chose to play Battery, one of the toughest songs they do. You can see him standing there sort of nonchalantly knocking out this riff, while the other guys are sort of almost playing up to his standard, not the other way around.
I could try Battery.
Battery? Yeah. You can play that fast with your fingers?
Yeah!
Battery!
Robert Trujillo, I always regard him as one of the best bass players I've ever seen.
Oh, he's an excellent bassist. I met him when he was still in Suicidal Tendencies. A really nice guy too.
He's phenomenal. He's an incredible bass player. He is incredible. He was incredible. I remember seeing Slayer at Ruthie's Inn. He was just all over the place.
Robert Trujillo is a very talented bassist on stage. He's probably a better player, technically, than either Cliff Burton or Jason Newsted. But if anybody's going to make a difference to that band, they have to be an equal partner and not a hired hand. And Robert Trujillo is a hired hand for Metallica. He's hired to play bass, do it very, very well. Absolutely very well. He's a dynamo on stage. But is he going to make any difference where it really matters in the studio when it comes to writing new songs and taking a lead in terms of Metallica's direction? I don't think so.
With Robert Trujillo in the band, a new album to promote, and the issues built up over the decades melting away, Metallica went on tour. But surprise, surprise, not everybody liked the new album.
The reason why St. Anger sounded the way it did was because they had an agenda behind it. They weren't just putting out an album with some songs. What they wanted to do was strip back everything, all the baggage that had accumulated over the decades, and go back to the old style and just produce a raw blast of musical fury. Now, while that approach is to be applauded, and in fact they bigged it up hugely before the record was released. This is the heaviest album, this is the fastest, it's extreme, it's this, that and the other. When it actually came out, everyone was ready for this, and there was this enormous disappointment because in fact it isn't that heavy, it isn't that fast, it isn't that exciting, it's not that powerful.
They've just lost sight of who they are, and are just kind of like, as people say, they're just kind of in this big loop, and I don't think they've really just kind of forgotten where they come from and what they were supposed to be.
The talent is still there, if the will is still there. Now, I feel that Lars and James are so far apart now, the only thing holding them together is the fact they're in the same band. And even then, they're not quite sure why they're in the same band. I think they need something radical. I think they need to shake up that band. And you know how I'd shake it up? I'd bring back Dave Mustaine. I think you put Mustaine back in that band with Hetfield, with Ulrich, and with whoever on bass. I get Newsted back. I think you actually have a great album in the making. But they need to shake things up because, to be honest, there's no connection between Lars Ulrich's traveling the world, hanging out with celebrities, buying art and following trendy music, and James Hetfield getting more and more into the redneck lifestyle, hunting, listening to country music, wearing cowboy boots. There's no connection between the two lifestyles anymore, and they come together and probably look at each other and say, who are you? Why are we sitting together? You put something like Mustaine into the mix as a catalyst, and I think then you have the real possibility of Metallica making another great album. And I'd like to see something of that radical nature happen.
It's one of those things where, you know, they've accomplished so much, you know, it's like, where do you go from here, you know? So now I think it's good, you know, it's important that they, like, you know, have fun with it, you know, have fun and just remember what it was about, you know. It's hard when you get older and you got, you know, your bank accounts are just like, you know, you can buy anything you want and you can do anything you want and you go wherever you want. It's like, what do? You know, it's hard to stay hungry when you're in that kind of situation.
Perhaps Metallica will surprise us all with more amazing metal albums, or perhaps they'll gracefully retire in a few years' time. But whatever happens, you can bet it'll be interesting and very, very loud.
It's not necessarily more fun now than it was. We've always maximized, when you said that, you know, every situation we've been in, whatever level it's been at, we've always tried to get the most out of it.
How you feeling?
Feeling good. I stopped drinking.
You really? You're on the wagon?
I'm on the wagon and my nerves are shot, but other than that, you know, I'm holding it together somewhat.
So we're proud of what we've done and what we do.
Okay, the last one is, how longer do you feel you can go? I mean, can you picture yourself?
With this interview? One more question. I think
Do you feel like you could be like the Rolling Stones with like 50?
Hey! Yeah. Enter Sandman. I'm not a prophet. I'm horrible at planning things. I can't, you know, that's why I got a wife, I think. But I'm not a prophet. When it doesn't feel right anymore, we're done. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Now I did what you do. Now I did what